The bustling terminal of the military base hummed with the usual chaos. Uniformed soldiers hurried past, their boots clicking against the cold tile floors. Luggage was being tossed around, announcements blared overhead, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. But amidst all the noise, Colonel Mark Thompson stood at the front of a small group of young Marines and SEAL candidates, barking orders with military precision. His eyes scanned the terminal as he kept a watchful eye on his soldiers. But then his gaze landed on an elderly man seated in the military lounge, his worn-out uniform and gray hair standing in stark contrast to the younger, sharper figures around him. The colonel's lips curled into a sneer. He walked toward the man, a quick pace of purpose in his steps. "Hey, you. This area is for active duty personnel." Colonel Thompson's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. He stood over the man, his posture straight and proud, arms crossed. "You can't sit here. Move to the general waiting area. This is no place for civilians." The elderly man, John Harris, remained seated. His face, though wrinkled with age, bore an expression of quiet strength. His eyes, dark and calm, didn't flinch. The colonel's words hung in the air, waiting for a response. But Harris simply continued to gaze forward, as if he had heard such insults countless times before. "Did you hear me?" The colonel barked again, this time louder. "I said move." Harris looked up slowly, his voice calm, yet filled with quiet authority. "I'm fine right here, Colonel." "Colonel?" Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Who the hell do you think you are? You look like a civilian, not some soldier. This is a military terminal, not some park bench." The young soldiers behind the colonel exchanged glances, whispering under their breath. The air around them buzzed with uncomfortable tension. The colonel's eyes narrowed as he took a step closer to Harris. "Tell me, old man," the colonel sneered. "What's your call sign?" Harris, still calm, did not react to the jabs thrown his way. Instead, he stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and graceful. There was a deep stillness about him that made the room feel quieter, even though the terminal was as busy as ever. "Falcon 7, Harris replied simply, his voice soft but steady. The response seemed to hit the colonel like a slap in the face. He froze for a moment, his expression turning from smug superiority to a mixture of confusion and disbelief. He expected the elderly man to stutter, to look flustered, maybe even apologetic. But instead, he had spoken with the kind of confidence that many soldiers half his age could only dream of. The room fell silent. The group of young Marines who had been watching the scene unfold now looked at one another in stunned disbelief. The colonel's eyes shifted from Harris to the other veterans in the lounge. Their faces were unreadable, but there was something in their gaze that made Thompson feel uneasy. General David Allen, who had been standing at the far end of the terminal, overheard the exchange and walked over. His presence immediately commanded attention, and even the colonel could feel the weight of it. Allen was a towering figure, known for his experience and distinguished service. As he approached, the soldiers in the terminal straightened, and the tension in the air seemed to deepen. "Colonel Thompson," General Allen's voice cut through the silence. "You've made a mistake." The colonel looked confused, and his face flushed a deep shade of red. "What do you mean, General?" "Falcon 7, General Allen repeated, turning his gaze to Harris, his tone now respectful. "That call sign belongs to one of the most decorated war heroes this country has ever known." The realization hit the colonel like a ton of bricks. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He had just belittled a legend, and everyone in the terminal knew it. The young Marines, who had been too afraid to speak, now watched the exchange with wide eyes, as if they were witnessing a crucial lesson on respect and humility unfold right before them. Harris remained calm, his expression unreadable. He had seen this kind of thing before. But for the first time in years, he felt a shift in the room, a shift that had nothing to do with the colonel's arrogance, but everything to do with the lesson that was about to be learned. General Allen took another step forward, his voice carrying weight. "Harris, or rather Falcon 7, is a man whose actions speak for themselves. He saved countless lives during his service. His name is synonymous with courage and sacrifice. And you, Colonel Thompson, have just made a grave mistake." The colonel's face turned pale. He had no words. His hands clenched at his sides, and his soldiers, who had once been intimidated by his commanding presence, now stood in silence, observing the unfolding scene. They could feel the tension, but more importantly, they could feel the shift in power. The colonel had been knocked off his pedestal, and Harris, silent, dignified, had taken his place. General Allen turned back to the colonel, his eyes stern. "Apologize." It wasn't a request. It was an order. The colonel stood frozen for a long moment, his chest tightening as the weight of his action set in. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. His pride, once so rigid, crumbled. I'm sorry," he muttered, the words barely escaping his lips. "I didn't know." Harris gave him a small nod, accepting the apology without a word. But it was clear to everyone in the room that the apology wasn't enough to erase the arrogance that had led to this moment. It wasn't enough to erase the lesson that had just been taught. But for now, it was a start. And sometimes, a start was all it took. As the colonel turned to leave, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just transpired, Harris remained standing, his presence as strong and steady as ever. He hadn't just made an impression on the colonel, he had made an impression on everyone who had witnessed the event. A hero was not always someone who shouted the loudest or demanded respect. Sometimes, a hero was someone who simply stood firm and let his actions speak for him. The terminal, once filled with the clatter of boots and the low murmur of conversations, now felt strangely quiet. Colonel Thompson, still recovering from the public reprimand, slowly made his way to the far side of the room. His soldiers, who had once admired his confident demeanor, now looked at him with something akin to pity. They had watched a man who had always been the authority figure, the one in control, be humbled in an instant. The lesson was not lost on them, but it left a bitter taste in the air. General Allen stood tall, watching the colonel retreat. He turned back to the gathered veterans and soldiers, who still looked bewildered by the scene they had just witnessed. The old heroes, once silent, now murmured among themselves, exchanging knowing glances. Harris, however, remained calm. He sat back down in his chair, his posture relaxed, as if he had been expecting this kind of disruption all along. There was no arrogance in his actions, no pride in the way he carried himself. He simply knew that sometimes, the most powerful way to teach a lesson was by being still, by letting others come to their own realizations. As the noise of the terminal resumed, General Allen took a few steps toward Harris. The two men exchanged a brief, respectful glance. Harris didn't need to say a word. General Allen understood. "Falcon 7, General Allen said quietly, his voice almost reverent. "You've taught him more today than I could have in a year of lectures." Harris smiled faintly, but said nothing. The general didn't expect him to. He had long ago learned that Harris wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, people listened. The general's eyes shifted back to the young Marines, who stood nervously by the wall. They were clearly eager to speak, to ask questions, but they hesitated. They didn't want to embarrass themselves, especially not in front of the legendary Falcon 7. The general saw this, and his expression softened. He stepped forward, addressing the young soldiers. "It's rare to meet a man like Harris. His story isn't just in the records of war, his story is in his actions, in how he carries himself. You will all learn much from him today." The soldiers nodded, their faces serious. Colonel Thompson's failure had left a deep impression on them, but they also felt a new sense of curiosity about the man they had once overlooked. They began to gather around Harris, cautiously at first, unsure of what to say. One of the younger Marines, a tall and broad-shouldered man named Sergeant James, finally took a step forward. "Sir," he began, his voice low and respectful. "What did you mean when you said, the real strength of a soldier lies in how they rise after they fall?" "I've heard it before, but I don't understand." Harris didn't look up at first, but the question seemed to strike a chord within him. He set down the book he had been reading, his fingers tracing the edges of the worn pages, before he slowly looked up at the young Marine. "Let me tell you a story," Harris began, his voice steady. "I was once part of a team sent on a mission that failed. It wasn't like the movies, no dramatic rescue or last-minute heroics. We didn't save the day. We didn't accomplish what we set out to do." The soldiers around him listened intently, the quiet hum of the terminal now fading into the background. Harris continued, his words slow but deliberate. "We were left stranded in enemy territory, and many of my men were injured. It wasn't the kind of mission that gets written about in books. There were no medals, no fanfare. I could have stayed angry, I could have blamed others, but instead, I had to make a choice. I could let the failure define me, or I could rise from it, learn from it, and keep moving forward. Harris paused, his eyes distant for a moment, as if reliving the memory. The soldiers remained silent, hanging on every word. The men who made it out with me, Harris continued, we didn't just survive because we were strong. We survived because we trusted each other. We learned from our mistakes, and when we stumbled, we picked each other up. That's the strength of a soldier, not in their victories, but in how they face their failures. The room was still as the weight of Harris's words settled on the soldiers. The young men, who had come to the military to prove their worth, began to realize that there was more to leadership than just triumph. Strength, true strength, was found in the quiet moments of vulnerability, in the willingness to rise when others would have stayed down. The silence lingered, heavy with reflection, before General Allen spoke again. Remember this, he said, his voice firm. It's easy to lead when things are going well. But the true test of leadership comes when things are difficult, when the outcome isn't certain, and when you must face your own shortcomings. A real leader learns from every failure and uses that knowledge to lift others up. Sergeant James, who had asked the question, nodded slowly, his face thoughtful. He looked around at his fellow soldiers, who now seemed to share a collective understanding. The lesson had been learned, not through an official training session or a drill, but through a quiet moment of humility. For the first time that day, Colonel Thompson re-entered the room. His face was still flushed with embarrassment, but there was a different air about him now. The arrogance had faded, replaced by a subtle humility. He caught sight of Harris, who nodded at him silently. It wasn't a gesture of forgiveness, it was an acknowledgement that both men had learned something today. And in that moment, they understood each other better than ever before. The colonel walked slowly to the edge of the terminal, his posture more relaxed than it had been when he first entered. The soldiers around him, the young Marines, watched him carefully, sensing that something had changed. They too began to realize that the true measure of a soldier wasn't in their rank or their uniform, but in their ability to learn, to grow, and to lead through both their successes and failures. As the terminal grew louder again, the sounds of life and movement returning, the soldiers knew that they had witnessed something that would stay with them forever. A lesson that would not be found in any textbook or military manual, but in the quiet strength of a man who had lived through more than they could ever imagine, and had come out the other side with wisdom that was far more valuable than any medal. Harris, once again, simply sat in silence, content with the knowledge that he had done his part. He hadn't just taught the colonel. He had taught them all. And for Harris, that was enough. The days that followed the incident in the terminal were quiet, but the atmosphere at the base had subtly shifted. Colonel Mark Thompson, though still carrying the weight of his public mistake, began to observe his surroundings with new eyes. He had always prided himself on his leadership abilities, his commanding presence, but now, as he walked the halls of the base, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The lesson that Harris had imparted on him, though indirect, had begun to take root in his mind. The colonel spent more time alone in his office, poring over old mission reports, reflecting on his actions, and questioning his approach to leadership. He had always believed that power came from control, that respect was earned through authority. But Harris's calm dignity had made him reconsider everything he thought he knew. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the military base, Colonel Thompson found himself standing in front of the door to the terminal lounge. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle, before taking a deep breath and entering. Inside, the same group of veterans was gathered, and the terminal once again hummed with activity. The young Marines, now somewhat aware of the events that had unfolded days earlier, watched the colonel's every move with quiet curiosity. The colonel scanned the room until his eyes landed on Harris, who was seated at a corner table, reading the same book he had been reading the day of the incident. Without hesitation, Colonel Thompson made his way over. The soldiers, sensing the shift in energy, stopped what they were doing, their attention now fixed on the two men. The colonel stopped in front of Harris, who looked up, his expression unreadable but calm. "Falcon 7, Colonel Thompson said, his voice firm, but with an underlying respect that hadn't been there before. He stood silently for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Harris, as always, remained still, waiting for the colonel to speak further. "I owe you an apology," the colonel continued, his gaze unwavering. "I didn't just disrespect you that day. I disrespected the very principles of leadership that we are supposed to uphold. I let my arrogance cloud my judgment." The room fell silent. The soldiers, once awkwardly shifting in their seats, now sat up straighter, fully aware that they were witnessing something important, something that had shifted the dynamic at the base. Harris put down his book slowly, his eyes meeting the colonel's. "You've already learned what you needed to," he said simply. "That's all that matters." The colonel felt a knot form in his throat, a mixture of gratitude and frustration building within him. He had expected some grand gesture or moment of profound wisdom, but instead, Harris had given him the simplest answer. Leadership wasn't about grandeur. It wasn't about commanding respect through authority. It was about understanding, growing, and being able to accept your flaws. "I didn't understand it then," the colonel admitted, his voice quieter now. "But now I see that the true test of leadership isn't in what you can demand from others, but what you can inspire in them." Harris nodded, as if confirming what the colonel had already come to realize. It's not about inspiring fear. It's about inspiring trust. Leadership comes from the ability to listen, to lift others up, and to be vulnerable enough to admit when you don't have all the answers. The room was still, the only sound the hum of the terminal's air conditioning. The soldiers, once looking to the colonel for direction, now found themselves looking at him as a man who had learned something vital, something they could all learn from. General Allen, who had been observing the exchange from a distance, slowly walked over to join the two men. His eyes were sharp, but there was a hint of approval in his gaze. "It's not easy," General Allen said, addressing the room as much as the colonel. "True leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being real. It's about owning your mistakes and growing from them." The colonel turned to face him, nodding. He understood now. He had spent years chasing the image of a perfect leader, one who demanded respect, one who could never show weakness. But that was not what made a leader. What made a leader was the ability to inspire others to do better, to work harder, and to trust in each other. It was the ability to learn, to adapt, and to grow. As the colonel stood there, silently absorbing the lessons he had learned, Harris slowly stood up, his movements deliberate and measured. "Remember this, Colonel," he said, his voice calm but filled with quiet strength. "The greatest leaders are the ones who lead by example. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be real." The colonel looked at Harris with a newfound respect. "Thank you," he said simply. Harris gave him a small nod, a sign of acknowledgement, before turning to walk out of the terminal. As Harris left, the room remained still. The soldiers, the Marines, and the veterans all silently reflected on what they had just witnessed. The colonel, who had once commanded the room with authority, had now earned something far more valuable, the respect of those around him. The colonel turned back to face the young Marines, their eyes on him, waiting for his next move. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice steady, but no longer filled with the arrogance it once held. "It's time to lead differently," he said, his gaze shifting to each of them. "It's time to listen more, to trust each other more, and to be real with ourselves. If we can do that, we'll become the leaders we were meant to be." The Marines, who had once seen him only as a strict and unyielding authority figure, now saw him as something more, a man who had learned from his mistakes and who was willing to grow, to lead with humility. As the sun set behind them, casting long shadows across the terminal, Colonel Thompson knew that he had taken the first step on a new path. It wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to lead in a way he never had before. The journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them, not with the arrogance of a man who thought he knew it all, but with the humility of a leader who was willing to learn, adapt, and rise above. And as the soldiers filed out of the terminal, they carried with them the lesson that true leadership wasn't found in dominance or perfection, but in the quiet strength to rise after a fall, to learn, and to lead by example. The base, though still filled with the usual noise of military life, felt different now. The air seemed lighter, the soldiers seemed more connected, and Colonel Thompson, for the first time in a long while, felt at peace. The days after the colonel's confrontation with Harris marked a significant change in the dynamics of the base. Colonel Mark Thompson found himself reflecting more, speaking less, and most importantly, listening more. His usual routine of issuing orders with authority shifted toward one of gathering opinions, considering feedback, and most importantly, taking the time to understand the people under his command. It wasn't a smooth transition. The colonel had spent most of his career commanding with the belief that a leader had to be invulnerable, unshakable, and always in control. Now, though, he understood that vulnerability was a form of strength, not weakness. It was about being real, and real leaders were willing to show their humanity. In the following weeks, the colonel made a conscious effort to connect with his team on a deeper level. He began visiting different units, listening to their concerns, sharing his own stories of failure and lessons learned. Some of the younger soldiers were skeptical at first, unsure of this new version of their commanding officer. But as the days went by, they began to see the change in him. The colonel wasn't just asking for feedback anymore, he was actively engaging with them, listening to their needs, and addressing their concerns. One afternoon, during a routine debriefing with a group of Marines, Sergeant James, the young Marine who had asked Harris the question about leadership, spoke up. He had always been the quiet type, but now he seemed emboldened by the new culture of openness. "Colonel, I've been thinking," Sergeant James began, his voice steady but laced with a hint of uncertainty. "I used to think that leadership was just about being the strongest, the fastest, the most capable. But now, I see that there's more to it. There's empathy. There's understanding. I just want to know how I can become a better leader too." The room was still as the colonel looked at him. There was a long pause. Colonel Thompson had expected the usual bravado from his soldiers, but here was Sergeant James, openly admitting a desire to learn to grow. It was a stark contrast to the young man who had once been all too eager to prove himself through sheer force. "You're already on the right path, Sergeant," the colonel replied, his tone sincere. "Leadership isn't just about what you do, it's about how you make others feel, how you lift them up, how you inspire them to do better. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be honest, and show your people that you believe in them." Sergeant James nodded, his expression thoughtful. He had always looked up to Colonel Thompson, but now there was a new level of respect in his eyes, not because the colonel was invincible, but because he was human. The rest of the meeting went smoothly, but something had changed in the room. The young Marines now seemed more willing to speak up, more willing to share their thoughts and concerns. The colonel knew that the walls he had once built around himself, the walls that had kept him distant from his soldiers, were beginning to come down. And while it felt uncomfortable at times, he knew that it was necessary for growth. Not just for him, but for everyone under his command. The transformation was gradual. Over the next few weeks, the colonel continued to engage more with his team. He sought out the wisdom of the veterans, asking them about their experiences, about the challenges they had faced. He didn't always have the answers, but he listened. And that made all the difference. General Allen, who had been a mentor to him for many years, noticed the change. One evening, as the two men sat in the officers' lounge, enjoying a quiet drink after a long day, the general leaned back in his chair and took a long look at the colonel. "You're doing it, Mark," General Allen said, his tone filled with a rare note of approval. "You've learned the hardest lesson of all. Leadership isn't about control. It's about connection." The colonel smiled faintly. "It's harder than I thought, General. But I think I'm finally getting it." "You are," General Allen agreed. "And I can see it in your soldiers. They're responding to you differently. They trust you more now. That's something you can't fake." As the colonel reflected on the past few weeks, he realized that General Allen was right. The change was evident in the Marines' behavior, in the way they interacted with him, in the way they supported each other. It wasn't a transformation that had happened overnight, but it was happening. And that was enough. But Harris's words still echoed in his mind. The real strength of a soldier lies in how they rise after they fall. The colonel had fallen many times in his life, through arrogance, through misjudgments, and through mistakes that he had tried to bury. But now, he had learned how to rise. Not on his own, but with the help of his team. And that, he realized, was the true essence of leadership. A few days later, during a rare moment of downtime, the colonel found himself once again standing in the terminal lounge. He wasn't there to confront anyone or to issue orders. He simply needed a moment to collect his thoughts. As he stood near the coffee machine, he caught sight of Harris, who was sitting at his usual spot, reading a book. The colonel hesitated for a moment before walking over to him. Harris looked up from his book, his eyes meeting the colonel's. The room was quiet, but the tension that had once existed between them had dissipated. "You were right," the colonel said, his voice calm and sincere. "About everything." Harris raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. He simply nodded as if to say, "I know." The colonel took a deep breath and sat down across from him. "I still have a long way to go," he admitted, "but I'm learning. I'm trying." Harris closed his book and placed it on the table. "You've already come further than most," he said quietly. "The hardest part is realizing that there's always more to learn." The colonel smiled, a genuine smile this time. "I think I'm finally ready for that." As the two men sat in comfortable silence, the colonel understood something important. The path to true leadership was not about asserting dominance or holding on to power. It was about self-awareness, humility, and the willingness to grow. And in that moment, surrounded by the hum of the terminal and the quiet presence of Harris, Colonel Thompson knew he was on the right path. The journey was far from over, but he was no longer walking it alone. He had his team. He had his soldiers. And most importantly, he had the humility to lead them in the right direction. And that, he realized, was enough. Weeks turned into months, and Colonel Thompson's transformation didn't go unnoticed. The base began to feel different, more connected, more supportive. Soldiers from all ranks, whether senior officers or young Marines, seemed to interact with each other in a new way. There was a sense of trust that had previously been absent, a trust that stemmed not from authority, but from genuine respect. The colonel had, over time, learned the power of listening, the strength of empathy, and the importance of showing vulnerability. He had realized that leadership wasn't about control, it was about connection. And this shift had rippled through the base, touching every person it reached. One afternoon, during a routine training exercise, Colonel Thompson walked among the soldiers, observing the drill with a keen eye. This time, however, instead of barking orders or correcting mistakes in a harsh tone, he paused and offered advice when necessary. His words were measured, thoughtful. When a Marine stumbled during a maneuver, instead of reprimanding him, the colonel bent down and helped him up. "You okay?" Colonel Thompson asked, his voice calm, without any hint of anger. The Marine, surprised by the colonel's approach, nodded. "Yes, sir. Just got off balance." "Don't worry about it," the colonel replied with a small smile. "We all fall sometimes. What matters is that you get up and keep going." The Marine's face softened, a look of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, sir." The colonel's presence, once marked by rigid authority, was now marked by something different, understanding. The Marine wasn't just an underling to be commanded, he was a teammate to be supported. As the training exercise continued, the colonel couldn't help but notice the subtle changes around him. Soldiers who had once kept their heads down now held their heads a little higher. They seemed more confident, more willing to engage with one another, to offer support where needed. The energy at the base was different. A sense of camaraderie and mutual respect had replaced the tension and fear that had once pervaded the atmosphere. General Allen, who had been observing the changes from a distance, couldn't help but smile. He had seen leaders come and go, but what was happening here was special. The colonel had done something few could. He had humbled himself, and in doing so, he had shown others the true meaning of leadership. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm orange hue over the base, General Allen invited the colonel to join him for a drink at the officers' lounge. The colonel, still adjusting to the newfound sense of balance in his life, accepted. As they sat across from each other, their glasses filled with bourbon, General Allen studied the colonel for a long moment before speaking. "You've done it, Mark," the general said, his voice tinged with approval. "You've turned this place around. You've shown them what real leadership looks like." The colonel looked at him, a humble smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, "but I've learned more in the past few months than I did in the last decade." The general nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Leadership is a journey, not a destination. The moment you think you've arrived is the moment you stop growing. You've got a long way to go, but you're on the right path. And more importantly, you've shown others the way." The colonel paused, considering the general's words. "I used to think that leadership was all about authority, about being the one everyone looked to for answers. But now, I realize it's more about guiding others, giving them the tools they need to succeed. I can't do it all on my own. And I don't want to." The general chuckled softly, raising his glass. "That's exactly it. The best leaders don't have all the answers. They make space for others to contribute, to share their ideas. And they're willing to learn from those around them." As they clinked glasses, the colonel thought about how far he had come. He remembered the day he had first entered the terminal, full of pride and arrogance, unaware of the lessons waiting for him. He remembered how Harris had silently, yet powerfully, changed his perspective. The colonel's eyes turned toward the lounge door, where Harris sat in his usual spot, reading a book. Harris had never asked for recognition. He had never sought to be in the spotlight. Yet, his quiet wisdom had done more to shape the colonel, and the base, than any lecture or formal training ever could. The colonel stood up, excusing himself from the general. He walked over to Harris's table, his footsteps steady but purposeful. Harris looked up as he approached, raising an eyebrow in silent acknowledgement. "Mind if I join you?" the colonel asked, his voice respectful. Harris nodded without a word, gesturing to the seat across from him. The colonel sat down, leaning back in his chair. For a moment, there was a comfortable silence between them. The colonel knew this moment was significant, but he wasn't sure how to express it. Harris, as always, seemed to understand without the need for words. "You were right, you know," the colonel finally said, his voice quiet. "Everything you taught me, it's changed the way I lead. I can't thank you enough." Harris looked at him for a long time, before finally speaking. "You don't need to thank me. You did the work. You took the lesson to heart. That's what matters." The colonel's eyes softened as he considered Harris's words. He had learned that leadership wasn't about what you received, it was about what you gave. The true measure of a leader wasn't in the recognition they earned, but in the impact they had on others. "I've learned a lot from you," the colonel said. "Not just about leadership, but about life. About humility, about strength." Harris gave a small smile, the same faint smile he had given when they first met. The best leaders learn from everyone they meet, even those they don't expect. The colonel nodded, feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't had before. The ripple effect of his change, of Harris's lessons, was now visible in the soldiers around him. They were learning, growing, and becoming better leaders themselves. The colonel didn't have all the answers, and he knew he never would. But that was okay. He had learned to trust his team, to listen, to lead with humility. And that was enough. As the night settled in and the terminal grew quieter, the colonel sat with Harris, grateful for the lessons that had come from both failure and growth. He had started this journey thinking he knew what leadership was. But now, he was just beginning to understand what it truly meant. The ripple effect had begun. And it was only the beginning. The days continued to pass quietly, but the change at the base was undeniable. Colonel Thompson's leadership style had evolved beyond recognition, and with it, the entire atmosphere of the base had shifted. What had once been a place filled with rigid hierarchy and unspoken tension was now becoming a place of collaboration, trust, and mutual respect. The colonel wasn't just respected anymore, he was revered. But this reverence wasn't born from fear or the command of authority. It was born from his willingness to be open, to learn, and to lead with empathy. One morning, during a routine meeting with his senior officers, Colonel Thompson noticed a marked difference in their approach to the discussions. They no longer simply nodded at his ideas. Instead, they engaged, asked questions, and offered their thoughts. It wasn't that they had lost respect for him, it was that they now felt they had a stake in the direction of the base, in the decisions that were being made. They felt heard, and that made all the difference. During one such meeting, Lieutenant Carter, a young officer who had recently been promoted, spoke up. He had always been quiet, a bit intimidated by the colonel's previous reputation, but now he was more confident, his voice steady. "Colonel, I've been thinking about how we can improve our training programs," Lieutenant Carter began. "What if we incorporated more hands-on mentorship, where the more experienced soldiers guide the newer ones? It might help build a stronger sense of camaraderie and trust." The room went silent, and for a moment, all eyes turned to the colonel. They had never heard Lieutenant Carter speak with such clarity before. The colonel, however, smiled, genuinely impressed by the suggestion. "That's an excellent idea, Lieutenant," the colonel said, his tone warm. "It's about building connections, not just skills. We'll try it. Let's set up a pilot program and see how it works." The officers in the room nodded, and a few even exchanged looks of approval. The colonel could see the respect in their eyes, not just for his position, but for his openness to their ideas. It was a far cry from the days when he had been the sole voice in the room, when his word was the final one without question. But it wasn't just the senior officers who were feeling the change. The young Marines, the ones who had looked up to Colonel Thompson with a mixture of fear and awe, were now more willing to approach him with their concerns. They saw him not just as a superior, but as a mentor, someone who genuinely cared about their growth and development. One evening, after a long day of training, Sergeant James approached the colonel as he was walking back to his office. The young Marine looked hesitant, but there was a certain confidence in his stride that hadn't been there before. "Sir, do you have a moment?" Sergeant James asked. The colonel, recognizing the shift in the Marine's demeanor, smiled. "Of course, James. What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about what you said during the last training exercise," Sergeant James began. "About how leadership isn't just about commanding, but about supporting your team. And I think I'm ready to take on more responsibility. I want to be the kind of leader who can help others the way you've helped me." The colonel paused, taken aback by the sincerity in the young man's voice. He had seen Sergeant James struggle with self-doubt in the past, but now he was standing before him, willing to step into the role of leadership. "I'm proud of you, James," the colonel said, his voice soft but firm. "That's exactly what leadership is about. It's about helping others rise, not just making yourself look good. If you're ready, then I'll help guide you in taking on more responsibility." Sergeant James's face lit up with a smile, the weight of his decision lifting as the colonel's words sank in. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." As the Marine walked away, the colonel couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment that he had never known before. He had always thought leadership was about being the strongest, the most capable, the one who stood at the front. But now he knew that leadership was about empowering others, about inspiring them to become the best versions of themselves. The colonel's shift in mindset had sparked a change in those around him. They were no longer afraid to take risks, to speak up, and to lead in their own ways. The culture at the base was evolving, one conversation, one act of support, at a time. But the true test of his leadership was still ahead. Colonel Thompson had come to understand that leadership wasn't a destination. It was a continuous journey of growth and adaptation. There would always be challenges, and there would always be room for improvement. But as long as he remained open to learning, open to evolving, and committed to guiding others, he knew he would be on the right path. One afternoon, after a particularly challenging day, the colonel found himself standing once again in the terminal lounge. The base was quieter now, with most of the soldiers off duty, but the familiar hum of activity was still present. As he walked past the corner table where Harris often sat, he noticed the old man, as usual, lost in his book. The colonel hesitated, but only for a moment. He walked over to Harris's table and sat down across from him. Harris looked up, his face breaking into a small knowing smile. "Colonel," Harris said, his voice as steady as ever. "It seems you've come a long way." The colonel nodded, his expression one of quiet gratitude. "I have. And I owe a lot of it to you." Harris didn't reply immediately. He simply studied the colonel for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "You found the real strength of leadership," Harris said finally. "It's not in what you can do alone, but in what you can help others accomplish." The colonel nodded, a feeling of deep appreciation washing over him. "I think I understand now. It's not about being the one who leads from the front. It's about being the one who helps others find their way." Harris smiled faintly, closing his book and setting it aside. "Exactly. Now go on and lead them, Colonel. The way you've been meant to." The colonel stood, his chest swelling with pride and humility in equal measure. He had learned the hard way, but now he felt ready. He had learned that true leadership wasn't about dominance, but about creating a legacy of growth, trust, and connection. As he walked away from the terminal, he glanced back at Harris, who had already returned to his book. The old man had given him more than advice. He had given him the gift of understanding. And that understanding, more than anything, was the legacy that the colonel would carry forward. The ripple effect had reached its final stage. Colonel Thompson had not only transformed himself, but he had transformed the soldiers around him. And through them, the base, the military, and perhaps the entire future of leadership, would be changed forever. And that, he realized, was the true power of a leader's legacy.